Okay, so today on Windows on the World, we're going to talk to Dr. Kevin Barrett and Dr. Nick Kollerstrom. Dr. Kevin Barrett is one of America's best-known critics of the war on terror. He is host of Truth Jihad Radio, a hard-driving weekly live call-in radio show. He has also appeared many times on Fox, CNN, PBS and other broadcast outlets, and has inspired feature stories and op-eds in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the Chicago Tribune and other leading publications. Dr. Barrett has taught at colleges and universities in San Francisco and Wisconsin, where he ran for Congress in 2008. He currently works as a non-profit organizer, author and talk radio host. Dr. Nick Kollerstrom is a science historian and author of many books, including Breaking the Spell and Terror on the Tube. His website is terroronthetube.co.uk. Now, today we're going to be talking about the terror attacks in Paris, Nice and Munich. And first of all, we're going to go over to Dr. Kollerstrom.
Yeah, hi there, Mark.
Okay, hi.
Well, it's so extraordinary. We've had these three major state-fabricated terror events in France, one after the other, and we're wondering, what do the French people think about this? Do they believe it? You know, we'd have three events which, as far as I guess the three of us concerned, there's very little evidence for any real blood or real wounded or real dead people. It all looks like street theatre. And how is it possible that the people of France just sort of are given this, and we don't hear much dissent from France. So I thought we really needed Kevin's view on this, as he's published some major books on the subject very rapidly in response to these events. I'm wondering, how does he think that the French people are taking these extraordinary events, and do they believe them?
Well, before we do that, Nick, I'd just like to just read out a comment. This is actually from your site, and it's a quote by President Hollande. And he was allegedly stated that those who have committed these actions, these terrorists, these Illuminati, have nothing to do with Islam. So do you think that's some kind of coded message to the French people?
Well, we thought it might be, but he hasn't said anything much by way of following that up, has he?
No, not at all.
And he's now deeply unpopular, and the state of emergency has been continued with this latest event in Nice. It's enabled the state of emergency to be continued for some months longer.
Yes, indeed. So, Dr. Kevin Barrett, would you like to make some opening remarks on this?
Yes, I think, unfortunately, the people of France are not rising up in outrage at these absurd false flags that are being foisted on them. The European Parliament has found that Operation Gladio, run out of the United States Pentagon through NATO, was responsible for most, if not all, of the spectacular and most mediatized terrorism during the Cold War in Europe. So one would think that all Europeans, especially the French, who are relatively well-educated and paying attention, should, as soon as they hear about a spectacular false flag event in their country, ask themselves, is this another kind of Operation Gladio false flag? But it seems that that's not the case. It's a minority of people there, as elsewhere, who are highly aware of these issues. And in fact, I think a lot of the French public opinion has been stampeded along in the direction of buying into the narrative that these acts are selling. And that is the narrative of the so-called clash of civilizations and the so-called war on terror, which are really code words for a war on Islam. And I think that France buys into this partly because historically and culturally, France is perfectly situated to buy into a war on Islam. There are really, two main currents historically and culturally in France, and those are the Catholic old France current, the deep France profonde, and then there's the post-French Revolution ultra secularist current. And these were the people, or the descendants of the people who burned down the churches and slashed the throats of the monks. Yes, it was French people doing that, not Muslims, and raped nuns and so on during the terror. So people in France are conditioned to hate Islam, both because there's this ultra-secularist current that hates religion, but they don't have any religion left to hate because Christianity has fallen apart. And then you have also what's left of the France profonde, that is this kind of more sort of centuries-old identity of France, which was actually created in a reaction to Islam. That is the Chanson de Roland and the whole history of how Europe came to think of itself as Europe and how France came to think of itself as the land of the Franks. Historically, that goes back to a series of wars against Islamic Spain. So France is perfectly set up to buy into this war on Islam, and that's why the Zionists have chosen France for the main arena of their false flag theater over the past year and a half.
Yes, well, that brings us into the wider view of what the war on terror is really about. But my view is that it's to terrorize the whole population of the world, really. And that's why we're seeing so many of these attacks now. And they do make a much wider and bigger picture, and that's what I'd like to go into tonight, at how we can sew this together so that people could put it together in their minds, because it is getting increasingly obvious to people like us who do some research, and especially both of you, because you do very deep analysis of these events and find out things that the general public would normally not be able to have access to because they don't really look. But the main thing is that we're getting a quick succession of these events, and there seems to be a losing control of the narrative, and that's where I wanted to bring Nick back in. What do you think on that, Nick?
Well, we don't seem to have dissent being expressed in France. I mean, this latest event, it's like a magician casting a spell. We see photographs of a lorry going along a road where it obviously shouldn't be, in the middle of Bastille Day, a huge white lorry. It's driving quite slowly, and that's all we see. And we don't see any pictures of anyone wounded or anything. And then we get a lot of stories. We get some maybe dummies, pictures of dummies put on the road. Dummies look sort of wounded or bit of limbs chopped off and so on. And then there's the terrific stories are woven around this, and it's a bit like a magician casting a spell in a sort of old-fashioned sense, that people are made to think that they've seen something, and everybody's given their dose of fear. I think it's so important to realise that the real victims of these events we're getting, state fabricated events, are us. We get the impact of the emotional shock, which challenges all our belief and faith in humanity. You know, how could people be so awful? Well, actually they aren't. Actually, it isn't happening. And we've got a mystery which we do really need to grapple with. Why are these huge theatre events being orchestrated? And the state must be colluding in these to make this happen. It can't happen without some degree of state collusion. And so there's a mystery. Why is the state colluding? And why do they need our fear? Is it just because the military is so big? Let's remind ourselves that France, Britain and America are the top world arms exporters, every year. They're huge arms exports. You've got a huge military industrial complex in these countries. And so it needs our fear to warrant whatever wars they want to get involved in. And that is the sort of nightmare motivation. And the cure has to be truth activists putting out the story, and I think we are getting somewhere. I think we are able to get somewhere. For example, what happens has never happened before with this event in Nice. The police authorities ordered all the CCTV to be destroyed, which always happens in these events, Mark. We're always used to, whenever they happen, no CCTV is available, right? That's been for years.
Absolutely correct, yes.
Ever since Lady Di was bumped off, maybe, the CCTV wasn't there on the streets of Paris, and ever since then, we're always used to that. But now something different has happened. The lady in the Nice constabulary, in charge of the surveillance, Sandra Bertin, she said, no, I won't do this. Sorry, our rules don't allow us. We've got 30,000 hours of CCTV over this whole beach, over this whole evening, and we're not permitted to destroy it. And there's legal action going on. They didn't like her report. They started telling her to redo her report. And this has never happened before, this kind of defiance. So, maybe that's some sort of hope. And the other ray of hope might be the Twitter, which Cynthia McKinney put out. Everyone remembers Cynthia McKinney. No one can forget Cynthia, I hope. And she put out a tweet saying, "Same Israeli photographer captures Nice and Munich tragedies," adding, "How likely is that? Remember the dancing Israelis." So both for Nice and 6 days later for Munich, we had the same photographer pre-positioned, as Kevin has very well expressed in a couple of articles, pre-positioned and all ready to start filming. As far as we can tell, it's him that took the films. He was there for both, physically there on both occasions, and that is so blatantly obvious. And the fact that his wife is a very senior Mossad agent, that is so in your face. I think that's just going around the world, that coincidence, and that tweet from Cynthia.
Well, it's very unlucky that he was in those two places in such quick succession, really. I mean, he must get around a bit. The chances of a coincidence there are quite small, I think. But what I'd like to go into, really, is looking at how the media projects this, first of all, because we're going to examine all three of these events, Paris, right, Nice and Munich.
Right.
And I'd just like to read something which is actually on Dr. Kevin Barrett's site, and it's the article, "Mossad false flag terrorist Gutjar accidentally deleted his Munich photos." And this is actually a quote from Christopher Berlin, but I think it's very important in people getting a grip and understanding what's going on. He states, "In acts of false flag terrorism, the perpetrators behind the deception come out with information very quickly to create a false narrative, which is then spread by the mainstream media. In the case of the terror attacks of 9/11, this early planting of the false narrative was done by the former Israeli Prime Minister and Chief of Staff Ehud Barak, who appeared on worldwide BBC television blaming Osama bin Laden and calling for an operational concrete war against terror before the Twin Towers had even fallen." Now, this is what we're given. We're given a kind of PR story to the press of who did it. And this was 9/11. It even happened with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We're told who the perpetrator is often before the event. With these events, we're told who the perpetrator is immediately after the event, aren't we?
Yeah.
Well, that's why they do have these publicists positioned to put out the early photos and video to cement the narrative in the public mind. And they've done this repeatedly. With 9/11, not only did we have Ehud Barak in the studio in London, the BBC studio, just minutes after the first plane impacted on the building. He obviously was there already in the studio before it happened, knowing it was going to happen, so he could give the entire official story, including the upcoming wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, immediately. That's the first thing people saw on television, was Barak giving them that story. And we have the same thing in New York, where the dancing Israelis were set up to film ahead of time. We had the Nodé brothers, who miraculously captured an image of the first plane hitting the North Tower, which is another of those outrageous coincidences, like Richard Gutjar, the apparent Mossad agent, being on location in both Nice and Munich. And I'm quite convinced that the Nodé brothers must have been there not at all by chance, but they had practiced the panning movement. They found the exact place to be to get that image, because there's virtually zero chance that anyone would capture that image of the first plane hitting the building in New York by chance. In 2001, there were not so many video cameras out there. So we had those instances of Israeli-linked publicists being immediately present on the scene, putting out the first narratives and the first images to get that official narrative into the public mind immediately, while people are still shocked and malleable. And we've had that same thing happen over and over and over with other attacks since then. With the Charlie Hebdo attack, there was an Israeli-linked supposed Polish worker who is on the balcony of a building owned by a very close associate of a leading pillar of the Israeli extreme right military-industrial complex.
That's right, yeah.
A billionaire named Laurent Dassault, I think is his name. He's a friend of Netanyahu, very close friend of Netanyahu. So this building happened to be where the guy was positioned to get the perfect images of the Charlie Hebdo attack. And then with the Bataclan photo.
Yeah, let's just point out, Kevin, that Charlie Hebdo attack only lasted a couple of minutes. It was a bit of street theatre,
yes.
a mock attempt, a mock image of firing blanks with policemen on the pavement. Only lasted a minute or two, and the Israeli news agent you mentioned was positioned there and ready to start filming just before it happened. You know, so he had to have known it was going to happen. Yeah.
Right, and then with the second Paris attack last November on November 13th of last year, we had this only one photo ever appeared showing any dead bodies, and that's the famous blood heart photo of the Bataclan nightclub with supposed dead bodies in very strange and anatomical positions strewn around the floor of the Bataclan. And then somebody had somehow smeared a gigantic blood-shaped heart on the floor of the Bataclan for reasons unknown. This is a bizarre photograph, and its provenance is unknown. All we know is that it appeared into the world, tweeted into the world out of Israel, and the person who tweeted it is a close associate of a leading American Israeli Zionist neocon think tank. So once again, they were putting out the images.
Just add on that. None of the French press dared to mention where that photo had come from. Okay, there was a deafening silence, and then one brave French journalist did find out a reporter called Bosch van Rosenthal had been the source, and Bosch van Rosenthal had posted the image on Sunday. That's 2 days after the event, and his source was Israel Newsfeed, led by Israel Hatzolah. Okay, so that was the ultimate source of that image, and Israel Hatzolah would then turn up again a bit later in the Brussels airport, didn't they? So
right. Yeah. Once again in Brussels, we also had Israelis apparently pre-positioned to get the early video and photo out to the world. And then, of course, we also had the Israeli company ICTS running that airport in the same way that they ran the airports used in the 9/11 attacks, and the same way that they ran the Amsterdam airport, where we had Mutallab, the so-called underwear bomber, escorted onto the plane, even though he had no passport and looked like he hadn't changed his clothes or taken a shower in weeks, if not months. He was escorted onto the plane by a well-dressed security agent-looking man, according to passenger and attorney Kurt Haskell. So once again, we see these Israeli links to these events, in particular Israeli links to the publicists who are putting out the early narratives, the early images, and the early videos.
Yes, and what it comes across as really is a kind of fairly sophisticated operation, but which is quite flawed, because we are able to see through what they're doing. Like in the case of the Brussels attacks, they used footage which was years old of a Minsk subway bombing, but then they tacked on this explosion to the front of it a bit later. It seems like there's a little bit of disorganization or bad organization going on. What do you think about that, Kevin?
That's a good question. You know, we've been scratching our heads about that. Everyone in the 9/11 truth movement eventually comes to grips with the problem that this is really too obvious. When I first discovered how bad it was, and that was about 2 years after it happened, it was in December of 2003 that I sat down and took a hard look at the evidence around 9/11 after hearing that David Ray Griffin was coming up with a book about it. So my reaction was, oh my God, you know, it's one thing to figure out that this was an inside job, but it's another thing to have it so clear, so obvious, so many, such a superabundance of evidence, far more evidence than one would need to be 100% certain, hundreds of times more evidence than you would need to be certain. And so that leads to the question, did they screw up? And that's what I assumed immediately. I thought, well, they must have really botched this, and this is our opportunity to pick up this evidence and run with it and change the world. So that's why I jumped into the truth movement. But since then, it's become clear that despite this kind of obviousness and this abundance of evidence, we still find that due to media control and political control, they're able to keep a lid on dissent. And we haven't had that revolution that one would expect. And some people have hypothesized that maybe they're doing this on purpose. Maybe they're sloppy on purpose. And they're doing that precisely to taunt us, to say, look, you're powerless. You can't do anything. We can do this right out in the open. We own the media. We own the politicians. We own the militaries. We own the intelligence complex. We own the banks. We have all the money. Anybody who steps out of line will never work in this town again. So you're powerless. Don't even think about fighting back. So it's possible that they're trying to send that message as well. And if they are, it's not working on me.
We're talking about something that was obviously years in the planning and was fairly sophisticated. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff there to go on, and I would recommend everyone look at Christopher Berlin's video. It's on YouTube, and it's something that refreshed a lot of the stuff that we were looking initially into in 9/11, but there's a lot of stuff in there that I actually didn't know, and it's called Christopher Berlin Speaks at Portland Community College. I'd recommend everybody have a look at that, because the finger of blame is pointed pretty squarely where it should be, in my opinion. We're going to take a short break now, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Paris attacks of 13th of the 11th 2015. We'll see you in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World. We're talking about recent terror attacks, and in particular in this section we're going to be talking about the Charlie Hebdo attack. So first over to Dr. Nick Kollerstrom. Nick.
Well, this massively reinforced the the theme of Islamic terror in the West. The great Charlie Hebdo event. People thought they saw terrorists coming in and shooting up a big satire magazine, Charlie Hebdo, but actually there weren't any dead bodies, there wasn't any blood, there were no death certificates, no inquests. I would say those people disappeared, and it was there was no real deaths. It was a kind of image that was given, and that was quickly followed up by this street theatre of cops apparently. A cop on the pavement, apparently being shot up by the bad guys who just got out of their car and shot him on the pavement, and that was because the earlier event didn't have any visible deaths or visible shooting. So that was, as it were, a visible shooting, and the bad guys were chased around a bit, and then a day or two later there was another theatrical. At a kosher supermarket where 4 Jews were apparently killed, and their bodies were flown to Jerusalem. I would say that means there's no inquest, no dead bodies, and again, that's just theatre. I would say all through Charlie Hebdo you had blanks being fired, you had crisis actors, you didn't have the real police, and so this was a massive street theatre event, I would say.
Yeah, Kevin, one thing I was just going to bring up was that a lot of people, when I try and talk to them about this sort of thing, they say, but that's impossible. There'd have to be hundreds of people involved. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that's actually a legitimate objection in some cases, or at least a partially legitimate objection that we do have to take seriously. For example, with the Nice attack, we really have to think hard about how there on the Esplanade des Anglais, they would be able to pull this off on Bastille Day without huge numbers of people being there to see it and record it on their cell phone cameras. I've been there. I spent several days in Nice back when I used to live in France, and I still am scratching my head over how they could have pulled this off. I suppose by blocking off the streets under some ruse. But I do think that my approach to these things is to really de-emphasize that aspect of it. That is the aspect of using crisis actors and whole communities. For example, with the Sandy Hook event, I haven't done a book on that. I've left that to colleagues like Jim Fetzer, who plunge in where people like me fear to tread, because precisely, what Fetzer is saying at Sandy Hook is that they closed the school in this community years ago, pretended it was still open, and then had an event with crisis actors at a school that had been closed for years. And to me, knowing how American communities relate to their schools, Everybody here in Lone Rock, Wisconsin is up in arms over the possible closure of a school. Everybody knows whether or not the school is open. How could you have a whole community in on something like that? It's absurd, and it really requires an extreme explanation. I mean, and so I'm very, very slow to jump on the bandwagon of positing situations that require huge numbers of people to be totally complicit for a very, very long time. However, we do know that it's a lot easier to cover things up and to have many people involved in these kinds of plots than most people realize. And we know that, for instance, by looking back at the documentation of Operation Northwoods, which was supposed to happen in 1962. It was a plan to simulate a Cuban shootdown of an American airliner, among other things. They were going to send 100 CIA agents under false identities onto a plane and send it towards the Caribbean and have it cross paths with a military drone, land at an air base, and then the military drone would be blown up by remote control. And the 100 CIA agents would get off at the military air base, and the headlines the next day would be screaming out that more than 100 American college students on vacation had died when Fidel Castro and the Cubans shot down their vacation airplane. Now, they would have then, of course, had to come up with grieving relatives in the media for 100 people. They had 100 carefully developed false identities that they could use in this operation, along with hundreds of people who would be actors, essentially, CIA and U.S. covert operations people and maybe privatized spin-offs who would have been playing the roles of the grieving victims. So they were all set to do that in 1962. That operation was less than a month away when it was canceled and shut down by Robert McNamara and perhaps President John F. Kennedy. So if they could have done that in 1962, and there would have been hundreds and hundreds of people aware that and there were also going to be bombings that would have killed Americans in American cities, and there would have been an American ship shot down or sunk on the high seas, as well as this fake plane shoot down. So we would have had a lethal false flag that would have killed many Americans. Hundreds and hundreds of members of the U.S. intelligence community and its spinoffs would have known that this was a hoax and would have been involved in hoaxing this event, and yet they were absolutely sure they could do it. And one of the reasons they killed Kennedy probably was that Lemnitzer, who was behind Operation Northwoods, was not happy that Kennedy and McNamara shut that down and wouldn't go to war with Cuba. Right. So by historical precedent, we know that hundreds and hundreds of people can be involved in a false flag attack that would kill large numbers of people of the country, that's pretending to be attacked, and that the people organizing this could be reasonably certain that those hundreds of people would be quiet forever. And if they could have done that in 1962, imagine what they could do today with the advances in technology, including mind control technology and plastic surgery technology and things like that. So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think that large numbers of people can be roped into these operations, and especially if it involves the Israeli Mossad. They have the network of Sayanim, that is volunteer Mossad agents in all levels of society, especially the higher levels of society, the media, and very important places in Western societies are occupied by Jews who are fanatically dedicated to the well-being of the state of Israel. So they volunteer to do what the Mossad tells them for free. And the Mossad is the envy of all the other intelligence agencies because they have this network of tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus potential volunteers, the Sayanim, who can be counted on to do these things and to keep quiet. So I don't think it's very possible, as Nick says, that in that kosher deli in France that was supposedly shot up during the Charlie Hebdo attacks, it's not at all a stretch just to say that those people maybe were not killed and the body sent home to Israel was all a hoax, and that a whole lot of people in the French Jewish community were in on this because they are dedicated to Israel. And when the Mossad says, come join us with this theatrical operation we're doing, of course they're going to do it. I mean, this is, it's not anti-Semitism to recognize reality. Everybody in the global intelligence community knows that the Israelis have this capability. I'm
glad you brought all that up because that does actually bring in the wider picture of what this is really about. If we go back to Charlie Hebdo, that was a pretty small operation. So we've gone macro, and let's bring it back down to micro again, because this was quite a small operation. So Nick's just responded with what he thought of Charlie Hebdo, and and just opened up there. So can you continue, because you've also written a book on this, haven't you, Dr. Barrett?
Yes, it's this is the book. I think I can't see my monitor, but I assume that you can see it. It's called "We Are Not Charlie Hebdo," and the French translation is now available. It's called "Nous ne sommes pas Charlie." And this book features a couple of dozen leading public intellectuals pushing back against the propaganda that was blasted out at the world on the basis of this very suspicious event. I went out of my way to include a wide variety of different viewpoints in this book. We have a hardline right-wing Zionist in this book, Barry Chamish, who accuses Netanyahu of being behind this attack. Then we also have a couple of other Jewish people, the liberal Zionist Jew Michael Lerner, in fact, America's leading liberal Zionist Jewish intellectual, and then an anti-Zionist Jewish professor, a history professor named Lawrence Davidson. We have, I think, 7 Muslims in the book presenting a number of viewpoints. We have, including the supreme leader of Iran, who has contributed to the book. And in this book, I would say, I think it's about 3/4 to 4/5 of the people who contributed are convinced that this was a false flag, and a few are not. And I intentionally tried to bring that variety of viewpoints into this to get a dialogue and debate going. You know, I don't want to just preach to the choir. I want Rabbi Lerner's audience to look at this book and look at this information, which they may never have seen before. And this book has so far had a great reception. I was able to do with 10,000 miles worth of book touring about this book primarily last year. And I think that it's the kind of a milestone and breakthrough in treating false flags.
Didn't a French minister say that your book was a security risk or something, or might be banned?
Yeah, there's been all kinds of pushback. Actually, not just a French minister. It was Francois Hollande himself who apparently attacked the book. He announced that they needed to lean on internet service providers to shut down conspiracy theories. And then his think tank, the Jean Jaurès Institute, put out a kind of a police bulletin on the world's leading conspiracy theorists who were posing such a threat to civilization. And I was on that short list. It was only, 5 or 6 of us, I think. And I made that list probably on the basis of this book, Nous ne sommes pas Charlie. And now I have another book out, a follow-up, another French false flag, also treating another attack in Paris. So I think I'm probably not very popular in certain circles in France, but I'm still hoping to get over there soon and talk about these books in French to the people there and see if I can, raise some awareness, because it's, as Nick suggested, I don't think that the majority of the French people are awake on these issues.
Let's go into now what the public were actually shown of Charlie Hebdo. I mean, the footage where there was the shooting outside the offices. Can you take us through that, Nick? Because that, to me, had many aspects of unreality about it, which you've looked into.
Yeah, well, they wanted this sort of exciting bit of footage where a car draws up at a predetermined spot, and we've seen how the photographers were all up on the roof, all ready to start filming, and somebody leaps out of the car and fires at a policeman who's already on the pavement. And it's very absurd that he's got this huge AK-47 gun and shoots it, and nothing happens. His whole head would blow apart if it was a real bullet. And the guy on the pavement, nothing happens to him, as if he misses or something. And then they get back into the car and drive off. That's the main image, and we can hear the distinctive sound of blanks being fired in this, as in various of these episodes.
Did Sky News report that they were going to put the blood on the pavement, or they were going to go to the pavement where the blood was?
Well, the next day, then you see somebody explaining that the blood has been. He slipped the tongue. He says you can see the blood is put there, and there's sign of the blood having been there the next day, but there was obviously none there on that day. So that was rather absurd. And there's another person asked about police about was the road closed off, because while this is going on, as with, for example, the Drumley Rigby Street Theatre in England, all the traffic is closed off, okay? No normal cars go along the road. And on the street where this happened, the Charlie Hebdo event, he was told it was been closed off since 8 o'clock that morning. So the police prepared it. It was a bit of film, bit of theatre, and the road's closed off when it happens,
Okay, Kevin, would you like to add any more on the Charlie Hebdo event?
Well, I agree completely with Nick's analysis of the supposed video of the supposed execution-style slaying of the French police officer by one of the so-called terrorists. It's absolutely clear that what we're seeing, if we actually look at that video, is the guy dressed as the terrorist with his AK-47 shoots off to the side of the head of the policeman, and the blank round, not a real bullet, but a blank round, kicks up a little bit of dust from the pavement about a meter away from the policeman's head. If that had been an actual AK-47 bullet, which are huge and very, very powerful, it would have cratered the sidewalk. It didn't. It was obviously a blank round of cotton or paper. I've had this confirmed by numerous ballistics experts. So they're still insisting, the authorities still tell us that that video shows the actual shooting of the policeman, and they say that that's how he died. It's completely absurd. So that video in itself is smoking gun proof that the official version of the Charlie Hebdo attack is very, very wrong, that something very, very different happened from what we were told.
Yes, it's also interesting to find out about the ownership of the magazine Charlie Hebdo. Could you go into that for us, Nick?
Well, it goes into the red. This rather quite obscene pro-Zionist satire magazine, which attacks the Christian and Muslim religions, and it was totally in the red a month before when a Rothschild, Nathan Rothschild, bought it. He owns the main shares in the French newspaper Libération. And he also bought this Charlie Hebdo mag and rescued it. And the team may have moved into his abode for a bit. It's quite mysterious where the Charlie Hebdo people are actually functioning, and the office that you see burnt down might not have been where they're actually living. So that's part of the mystery of this event. But it was certainly taken over by Rothschild, and then the week after, they produced, was it 3 million copies? They produced their biggest ever sale of the Charlie Hebdo magazine after most of the staff had allegedly been killed off. Somehow this phantom staff, skeleton crew of a staff Charlie Hebdo managed to bring out the biggest ever sale of their magazine.
That's really interesting. What I'd like to do now, before we go to the break, is get both you and Dr. Barrett to give your main 3 points of evidence. If you were in a court and you were trying to prove this to be a false flag event, what points would you use? Over to you first, Dr. Barrett.
Okay, well, the first one would be the one that we just mentioned, which is the video allegedly showing the killing of the French policeman that shows no such thing. Again, that is the biggest, most obvious smoking gun we have here. For the second item of evidence, I think I would bring in the suiciding of the French policeman, Elric Freudou, who was looking into the very, very suspicious background of how Charlie Hebdo magazine was kept afloat, even though it was losing money for years. He was looking into the fake family background of Chab, the editor, Stéphane Charbonnier, who apparently had a fake relationship going with a woman who is an operative of Sarkozy and Netanyahu. And so Elric Freudou, the French policeman, was on that case the very night of the shooting. And he called home and said he couldn't come home because he has a very hot lead. He would have to be working up all night. And then at about 1 a.m, he was found with a bullet in the head in his office. I think that when someone with a hot lead, and then he had been ordered off the case by his superior officer. And so that's a very, very strong circumstantial piece of evidence that there's a bloody cover-up going on and that we need a real investigation. So that would be number 2. For number 3, I think I would bring in the intelligence connections of the patsies in this case. It's clear that these patsies that they blamed, who were, well, let's keep it simple here and just point out that the story of their escape after they supposedly shot that French policeman was that they drove straight to the center of the main Jewish neighborhood of Paris and then got out of their car, made a mistake, I guess, and dropped their ID card or ID cards in the car. Mm-hmm. So that's the only way that the government was able to solve the case, they told us. And then hijacked another car. This was right in front of Pâtisserie Restaurant and Cafe, which was owned by a leading French extreme Zionist a member of the Jewish Defense League, which is a terrorist group, according to the FBI here in the U.S. They have a benefit every year, a celebration event for the IDF, cheering for the IDF's success in massacring people in Gaza every year. So the full story, the story of these patsies, how they escaped supposedly, where they went, they're mysteriously just dropping their ID cards so that the government could solve the case, and doing it in front of basically the IDF Mossad Jewish Defense League headquarters in Paris. All of this, plus their background as intelligence assets. Both of them had been arrested for pornography, and then it was made to go away when supposed radical Muslims are arrested for pornography, and the charges go away. You know that they've been recruited as assets. There's all sorts of other evidence as well. So I guess that third item of evidence would be the escape route and background of the patsies.
That was brilliant. Does your evidence differ in any way, Nick?
Well, only one thing one could add. If there was some formal opportunity to ask for evidence, I would personally ask for death certificates, which I live in England. I can't really get French death certificates, but I think these are quite difficult to fake, and I'm suggesting these people are all still alive and that nobody died, and it would be quite difficult for them to produce death certificates.
That's great. Okay, we're going to take a short break and we'll come back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm with Dr. Kevin Barrett and Dr. Nick Kollerstrom, and we're going to now talk about the Paris attacks at the Bataclan Theatre on the 13th of the 11th, 2015. So first of all, Nick, you did quite a lot of investigation into this, and just tell us a bit about what you found and the anomalies.
Well, this was an amazing and deeply planned event. For example, it was foreshadowed. The intelligence ministers were telling the newspapers that an event was going to happen. Paris Match said France's 9/11 was going to happen, and it would be impossible to avoid. And the attacks of France will be on a big scale, and so on. And then there was an augury, should we say, on the front cover of The Economist, looking a bit as if they were predicting this date, 11, 13, 15, looking very much as if they had, with the context of France and Paris and the Louvre. And as before, as usual, we get big terror drills on the very day in Paris, large gatherings of ambulances and so on, getting ready for a terror drill. And in a sense, the whole thing that happened was that drill. It was just sort of spilled over into becoming live. And it had several components. There was a big football match, and then there was a very dramatic Bataclan theatre with the Eagles of Death Metal. And there were terrifically dramatic street shootouts. Well, we still don't know what happened. I mean, one thing we can say definitely is that you get white male killers involved, these street shootouts, big burly SAS-looking types wearing all black with big guns, start firing into cafes, and this looks very terrifying. And the fact that they're white and reported in newspapers as being white apparently doesn't impede the Islamic terror theme from being reiterated. That's a rather extraordinary feature. I would say again, we don't see anyone in pain. You get rather bored-looking crisis actors. French crisis actors always wear this snazzy gold foil, as if it's some sort of uniform to show, look, we're acting, we've been wounded. You don't see any real blood. You see bodies lying on the ground covered over with just covered over the blankets. And for example, the huge football match, you hear bangs over the PA system, and it is alleged that suicide bombers have let off their suicide vests outside the stadium. And the media are full of suicide bomber stories, but you don't see them at all. There's absolutely no trace of evidence of any suicide bomber anywhere around on that Friday the 13th event. What you do get is all the doors are closed and everyone in the huge football match at the end of the match is made to feel something funny is going on, and they're told a story. So we have to wonder, what really happened. And the strangest thing of all was the Bataclan. I suggest we still don't know what happened. That was a publicly advertised concert by the Satanist Zionist band, Eagles of Death Metal, and were they interrupted in the middle by a terrorist? Did the whole thing go dark? Were people shot? I don't think so. And Kevin's already alluded to the photograph, which appeared 2 days later, of various dummies on the floor of that Bataclan theatre. So it's still very mysterious what happened around about midnight at that theatre.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it brings us again back to the question of how many people must have been involved. But if you look at any kind of, even if you go back years and look at any kind of so-called riot situation, with a lot of people, 99% of those people would get their information about that event from the news. They would not have known what went on there. So it is quite easy to contain these events, I think. I think it's much easier than people think. But we should go over now to Kevin, because obviously you've done an awful lot of research into the Paris attacks as well. What would you say to add to Nick?
Here's Kevin's book on the subject.
Yes.
Another French false flag.
Another French false flag.
Bloody tracks. Yeah,
we have the same book.
So
yes.
I recommend everyone get a copy of this. In-depth, up-to-date investigation of how Europe is being ruled, undermined, sabotaged by self-fabricated terror.
Well, I'll certainly be reading that. So over to you, Kevin.
Yes, I agree with what I'm hearing from Nick. I think we should emphasize that the Economist cover, which appeared to predict the date of the Paris attack, contained a number puzzle, 6 digits. And those 6 digits were sitting right next to an image of a painting by Leonardo, which is found in the Louvre. Those 6 digits could only be arranged to form one date in 2015, and that was November 13th. Whether using the American system, 11/13/15, or the European system, 13/11/15, that was the only date in 2015 that you could get from those 6 digits.
Right.
And that and this was the cover of The Economist magazine telling us what was going to happen in 2015. It was published in late 2014, and it was what's coming up next year in 2015. So they have a picture from the Louvre next to these 6 digits, which only form one date, November 13th, 2015. I don't think you have to be a crazy conspiracy theorist to say, wait a minute, this is a rather amazing coincidence, if it's a coincidence. But we've seen over and over how they forecast their next terror attack.
Yeah,
they
but also, there's a couple of arrows being shot connected with these numbers, and also some sort of missiles on the ground just right next to it. So it has to be an attack. Those numbers,
yes.
You're given the imagery of an attack going on.
It's a very clear message. Just in the same way that we had clear messages from Netanyahu before these attacks, throughout all of 2014, leading up to the Charlie Hebdo attack on January 7th, 2015, Netanyahu repeatedly threatened France with terrorism. During the summer of 2014, as the Israelis were slaughtering people in Gaza, Netanyahu told France that if France continued to side with quote unquote the terrorists, meaning the Palestinians, that terror is going to come to your country. And that obviously was not suggesting that Islamic or Palestinian terror was coming to France, because why would Muslims or Palestinians terrorize France in response to France supporting the Palestinians? Clearly, Netanyahu was threatening that Israel would bring terror to France. And then once again, on December 1st, 2014, just 1 month before the Charlie Hebdo attacks, Netanyahu announced that if the French parliament recognized Palestine, that France would be hit by terrorism. And once again, that's precisely what happened. The French parliament did vote to recognize Palestine, and then on January 7th, shortly thereafter, terrorism came to France, just as Netanyahu had promised. So they do tell us what they're going to do. And then the same thing happened again. This time, Netanyahu also made threatening statements before this event. It was predicted in the Rothschilds publication, The Economist, as you said. And then we could add, Nick, that the Bataclan Bloodheart photo, the only photo featuring any supposed corpses from this event, that blood heart appeared to have been painted in blood on the floor of the Bataclan. It's about each, the lines made to paint this heart are about the width of a human body. This is a huge blood heart painted on the dance floor. Who did that and why? It makes no sense whatsoever. How could this have appeared innocently? Well, and what does it mean? Why did they do that? Well, we learned when the Brussels attack happened why they did it, because the logo of the Brussels airport, which was the focal point of the next upcoming attack, is in fact this heart, a smeared heart shape that looks exactly like this blood-smeared heart on the floor of the Bataclan. And the motto of the airport in Brussels is the Brussels airport, the heart of Europe. So terrorists attacked the heart of Europe. And that's precisely what they told us was coming when they painted that blood heart on the floor of the Bataclan, and then used that to terrorize the world by, the Israelis tweeting out that photograph into existence. Yeah. So they tell us what they're going to do. They announce it ahead of time, and the Economist cover should be understood in that framework. And then also, Nick, you're right that the event at the stadium that began the Night of Terror on November 13, 2015, is very, very dubious. The official story holds that a couple of suicide bombers tried to enter the stadium, but they saw they were going to be searched, and they walked off to far corners of the parking lot where they could be completely alone, away from any other people, and there blew themselves up. This is the darndest suicide bombers that I've ever heard of. And likewise, we had anomalies at the other scenes of the other attacks as well. As Nick said, we had large white paramilitaries seen doing the shooting at the Belle Equipe Cafe, and we had all sorts of anomalies at the Bataclan nightclub as well. It's conceivable that this could have been done with fewer killings than we were told, or maybe no killings at all, although to me, that's a bit of a stretch. One could imagine that in a pre-planned event like this, they could have a public event, so innocent people would be there in the crowd who didn't know what was going to happen, as well as plenty of people who did know what was going to happen who were part of it. Mm-hmm. And then they could have had people dressed as terrorists come in and pretend to shoot. We could have had people, slap their blood paste packs, boom, and pretend to get hit. That would have created panic, and everyone would have fled for the exits. And nobody who fled and saw apparent mayhem would have realized that it was all theater. That's something along those lines might
right. Yeah, that does sound good. Yeah.
Or it's also possible that there were real shootings. I don't really know what happened there.
Well, I think when these things happen, if someone starts firing, people panic and run, then you often hear this from eyewitnesses from these real events when a shot really has been fired. I mean, when you're in a big crowd, it would seem rather distant from you unless you're right next to it. Most people don't have a good recollection of the event either. So the witnesses we heard afterwards, their stories did seem to me to be rather contrived and a bit homespun. It didn't really, there wasn't really anything very convincing, and as far as the symbolism goes, if this is a cult symbolism, then it's a little bit obvious, isn't it, really? And that's what I think is the most apparent thing now, is that they're getting more obvious, and we're going to get into that a bit later. But is there anything else you'd like to add, Nick?
There was the aspect of Jewish precognition, and the Bataclan owners is owned by major Zionist Jews who then sold it on September the 11th, just before the event, and moved to Israel, then the Jewish Chronicle the Jewish newspaper the Times of Israel said that they'd had a warning that the event was going to happen, and the Jewish community knew on that Friday morning. Security officials in France's Jewish community were informed, according to the Times of Israel, so that is precognition, which they often claim to have for these events, they are, as it were, the only people who know that it's going to happen.
As Netanyahu knew that the 7/7/2005 London bombings were going to happen, as you know from your book on that, Nick,
Right.
which I think is still the best source out there. There's some other good stuff too, but your book is the go-to book on the London bombings. And Netanyahu canceled his appointment. He got forewarned, and it's still, now the Israelis are claiming that they were forewarned by the Brits, but this Israeli precognition, which we've seen in so many of these instances. On 9/11, we had Odigo instant messaging services putting out a warning not to go to Lower Manhattan in Hebrew.
Right.
We had Zim Shipping Lines, which is owned by the Rothschilds and the State of Israel, vacate and break its lease and move out of the Twin Towers just 1 week before 9/11. We have many, many instances of this kind of foreknowledge. We also, back at the Charlie Hebdo event, I believe, we also had the cafe, that Pâtisserie cafe owned by these hardline Zionists. They also, I think they sold that Pâtisserie right before, or no, it wasn't Pâtisserie, I'm sorry, it was the kosher deli where the shootout happened. The owners of that kosher deli, who were also linked to hardline Israelis, Zionists, sold their kosher deli right before the event and moved to New York. And of course, that kosher deli then was shut down. So they were very, very lucky indeed. And so we see these kinds of indications of foreknowledge repeatedly on the part of people linked to Israel with these events, once again indicating that the prime geostrategic beneficiary of these events is probably orchestrating them.
Absolutely, and that's ironically the thing we're not even allowed to talk about or mention, and the mainstream media will not even go there. And once you do mention it, of course, you're anti-Semitic. I mean, it is a very ridiculous situation that we're in. We're going to take a short break now. We'll come back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm with Dr. Nick Colostrum and Dr. Kevin Barrett, and we're now going to talk about the attacks in Nice, this lorry attack, which was fairly recently on the 14th of the 7th, 2016. So first of all, Nick, over to you.
Well, I'm just amazed that the French people will keep believing this stuff. I mean, it's street theatre. We don't know quite how they pull it off, but there was a 200 yards expanse on the Promenade des Anglais in Nice, just by the coast, and this huge lorry, I mean, it's said to have ploughed into the crowd, and we don't really see any pictures of them in the crowd, and we don't see any wounded, we don't see the dead, and a large lorry like that isn't that manoeuvrable. And by the way, we never saw at all the driver. There's no pictures at all which show the driver. Some people have wondered, was this remotely controlled, this van? And they finally named this alleged terrorist, who's the focus of the whole story. And then he pipes up. He says he's in Tunisia, he's not in France at all, and he strongly objects to his name being used, and he can prove that he was in Tunisia at the time. And then that's the next day. And then a few days later, something further is published from him saying his whole life is now being ruined. He can hardly go out at all because everyone's calling him a terrorist, and he doesn't dare to come back to France again. And this identity theft is a very common element of these stories. That they got some sort of passport from him, evidently, and they wanted to use it in this event. That they claimed it was next to this guy in the lorry, so they've stolen his identity and were using it for their story. But I think the most remarkable thing about this story is all the dummies on the road, and they turn up on a video which appears on the Pamela Gellar website. Now, she's a sort of rabid US Zionist. She's in favour of the war of civilization, of the inevitable clash with the Muslim world. And her account of this was dated the 14th. Now, this happened, let's just go into the numerology. 14/7. You got 77 dead on 14/7, okay? Then they changed that to 84. So they're playing number games as well, multiples of 7. These are all multiples of 7. Anyway, Pamela Gellar's website goes up on the 14th. Now, if you think this happened at 10:30 at night, that means if she was in New York, she would have had a few hours to hear about the event and then put up this video. And the video is a lot of people walking down the road, or somebody walking down the road holding this video, panning through various inflatable rubber dummies that are supposed to look wounded, okay, or they do look wounded, but they don't look at all human.
Well, they look, the bodies looked very disjointed, and they didn't look like they were even if you'd been run over. They were in very unnatural positions, from what I remember of looking at that video.
Yeah, they looked kind of wounded, as if there'd been some other terror drill, and they just reused them. As you pointed out, they didn't look as if anyone would look if they'd been run over. You know, the limbs weren't crushed as if somebody had been run over. They were just there. So I think that must have been done beforehand. For Pamela Geller to have that video sequence, I would think that has to be done on some previous day, maybe early in the morning or something, when there weren't crowds there. They would have to just close off a bit of the road and put those dummies there, so she would then be given that on the evening of the 14th, so that her website can go up. And in a way, that was the first report we had of this event on Pamela Geller's website. The next day, stories of the Nice event started obviously appearing in all the world's newspapers, and Pamela Geller's is the only one I'm aware of on the 14th. Okay.
Yes, and the other thing that struck me was that the van, the truck that was used, was completely unmarked, and it reminded me very much of the lorry that was used on the Lee Rigby killing.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It was an unmarked, completely unmarked lorry, and I've never seen one outside of these events like that. I don't think I've seen one on any road in Britain or even abroad that's completely unmarked. Where did he get that lorry from?
Yeah, it is strange, isn't it? You expect adverts or who it belongs to, whatever. Not a drop of blood on it, not a drop. But also, as Mark points out, where on earth can you get a lorry without any mark on it?
What do you think of that, Kevin?
Yes, it is very strange. The bullet holes are somewhat dicey as well. We see the apparent entry holes. We don't see exit holes on the other side through the windows and stuff. And as far as the bodies, you mentioned that they're in kind of strange anatomical positions, and that reminds us a bit of some of the positions of the corpses or alleged corpses from that famous Bloodheart photo of the Bataclan.
It does indeed, yeah, right.
Retired Canadian intelligence officer contacted me as soon as that photo appeared and said, look closely at the way the limbs are positioned in some of these bodies in the Bataclan. And so we saw that again in Nice, and it does suggest the possibility that they're using so-called dapper cadavers. People can look this up on an internet search engine. It's spelled D-A-P-P-E-R, dapper cadavers, and they're sold for various kinds of uses, medical uses and other uses, and their joints are not like human joints, so they can be easily flexed into anatomically difficult or impossible positions. And it seems that that may be what they're using in some of these terror events.
The other thing that was quite strange about it was how would somebody get in there with basically a camera phone into a crime scene like that with dead bodies everywhere?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's,
right.
I wasn't. That's something that I always find a bit strange, that people never question the source of the photography, which is usually really, really blurred and bad. Now everybody's got a camera phone now, so theoretically there should be a lot of stuff uploaded onto YouTube.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a big major event going on, hundreds of people just upload footage of it. But in Nice there was nothing there. Now, is there any reason that you can think of, Kevin, that would be the case? I mean, would YouTube be pulling it all down?
Yes, that's also a problem with Orlando.
Yes.
We have a real shortage of authentic video from Orlando. One would think if this shooting in the Orlando nightclub went on for hours, there were people, stuck in there, hostages, things were going on. It was going on for quite some time, but there's very, very little amateur video, practically none. And the same seems to be true of Nice. If indeed this, 50 people were killed and more than that wounded by this truck, there also would have been a lot of people who would have managed to get out of the path or been, who would have been around there. There should be huge numbers of eyewitnesses, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, all of whom could have pulled out their cell phones and filmed it. So where is that footage? It really does raise questions about whether this was a crisis actor type of event with the whole area sort of roped off in advance, because otherwise, where is this footage? Now, in France, they do have an advantage if they're trying to pull this kind of thing off with the law that states that you're not allowed to disseminate images of terror victims that could impugn the dignity of the victims. This is the law that the French government used to prosecute Hicham Hamza of panhamza.com, who tweeted the Israeli tweet of the blood heart at the Bataclan. And he wrote a story about how the people who had put this blood heart into circulation were violating French law, and they were also highly suspicious for a number of reasons, including this the inherent photo itself being highly improbable. So he tweeted that story with that photo, and the photo was evidence against the criminals. And then they charged him. The French government actually arrested Hicham Hamza for supposedly impugning the dignity of the victims at the Bataclan by tweeting this photo, which actually had been first tweeted by the Israelis, and his news story was about that. So they have that law that you're not supposed to be able to publicize any pictures of victims in these terror attacks. So they can claim that maybe that's why the 100+ people who should have filmed this truck attack didn't put it on YouTube. And so that way they can select and make sure that what gets out there is precisely what they want to get out there, and they can charge anybody who's putting up anything that they don't want publicized.
So how come Pamela Geller wasn't prosecuted then?
Right. Well, she's obviously the official. So she's ISIS's public relations agent, which, I don't know about radical Muslims, what kind of radical Muslims would choose an extreme Zionist PR agent like Pamela Geller and her Mossad handlers. But ISIS apparently is indeed the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service.
Yeah,
Well,
you notice the way when
yes.
the thing was first being reported, it was always ISAR terror truck or an ISAR terrorist. They made up these stories of people trying to get into the cabin and attack the driver, and it was always the ISIS terror truck they were grappling with. So they were putting out that theme right at the start in every reporting of it.
And that story of the heroic... The heroic efforts to stop the truck remind me of the heroic efforts to take down the plane on 9/11. Obviously, another scripted story, the story of Flight 93 being taken down by heroic passengers.
That's the point, yeah. I mean, the photographic detail we have precludes any of those hero stories. They're the heroes, leaping off their motorbike or leaping off their bike onto the front cab and trying to punch the driver, and the driver then trying to shoot them, and so on. And none of that happened at all, because the pictures don't show that.
I think another thing though is the angles of the photography by our famous Israeli photographer, who's the unluckiest man in the world. He seems to be at these last two terror events. He must be extremely traumatized by it all, being the only person with a camera phone there. But the pictures that we were shown of the lorry driving towards the crowds was that the lorry was then engulfed by the trees, and it wasn't really going very quick. And then the next thing is you get where it cuts. It's almost like it's a bad movie, so it cuts in the right place to what we're meant to see. The point of view changes, but there's no real evidence of the lorry actually hitting anybody.
No,
you don't see that.
No.
And that's where we should have there should have been lots of cell phone videos of that. And so where are they?
Exactly, which is...
Well, one possible course of action would be bangs went off, and you're not quite sure if they're fireworks or guns being fired. There might have been the police firing guns in the air, and the police did tell people to run, okay? So people would be scared hearing guns going off, and they could all start running away very quickly. And you do see pictures of people running away, and that could have been one way the police, as it were, got rid of everybody, and to do whatever they wanted to do, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
that's another example of how these terrifying events terrorize the public in such a way that they're not thinking clearly. And so the official story could be easily implanted in the suggestible, terrorized mind.
Yes, could we have your primary evidence then, Nick, for your key points here, your key points in law that you would bring into a court?
Well, first of all, any evidence that this terrorist was in France or was driving the van, that would be the first thing. I'd say you don't have him present at all. Then I would very much like to have somebody at the local hospital, a witness at the hospital, did wounded people turn up to the hospital? I mean, I think this kind of nitty-gritty detail is really the place to start, to get away from the sort of hallucinatory story that we're all given. Can we have a bit of mundane detail? Were there any real wounded? Because as with so many of these events, let's just mention this, you don't get any real emergency services turn up. You don't get any real ambulances or people with stretchers. You see pictures of alleged bodies covered over with blankets and people hanging around them, and that's it. That's just the theatre. So one bit of real evidence, I would think, will be asking a hospital if anybody turned up that day, and then I think almost the only real picture you've got is the one that Gutjahr took. You see, you've got the lorry literally starts on its course when Gutjahr photographs it. It's travelling very slowly before that, and it starts up to accelerate, goes up to about 20 miles an hour, and travels about 200 yards. I think if a third bit of evidence might be just the state of the lorry. I mean, they took off the front guard bonnet of the lorry to try and, I suppose, to avoid people seeing that it didn't have any damage or whatever. And it had some bullet holes stuck onto the front windscreen, which I don't think people really believed them because the glass wasn't cracked at all. So I think in these events, the lorry will just disappear. Nobody will be allowed to examine it. But if there was a real criminal investigation, you would have the lorry to be examined. People would be allowed to examine the lorry. And as Kevin indicated, there are no real bullet holes in that lorry. There are people who have made holes in one side, but they're too large to be bullets. So I would think being allowed to examine that lorry and what state it's in, that would be a good bit of objective evidence, yeah.
Exactly, and if we go back to 9/11, they managed to get rid of the Twin Towers, so getting rid of the evidence in these events is pretty easy compared to that, isn't it, really? Dr. Barrett, would you just like to give your key points here?
Well, I certainly agree about Richard Gutjahr, married to Einet Wilf, the high-ranking Israeli black operator, tied into the pro-false flag think tank, WINEP, Washington Institute of Near East Policy. I mean, that's the huge smoking gun for me, that this guy is there pre-positioned to film the attack, and then he turns up again in Berlin to film that attack, as does his daughter.
In Munich.
In Munich, yeah, that's right. That's too much of a coincidence, so that's number one for me. And then for my other 2 points of evidence, I think I would point towards the cover-up. First, the French government ordered the destruction of all of the CCTV footage for 24 hours surrounding that attack, and the Nice municipal authorities refused, and so there's a legal battle going on. Why is the counter-terror division of the French National Police trying to destroy all of the CCTV evidence about this event? That is a smoking gun to me. Yeah. And then third, also, we have the case of the local government prosecutor, the police person they're pressuring her to put false information in her report, and she went public about that. So clearly there's a cover-up going on, and sometimes in these cases it's not the crime that gets you, but it's the cover-up.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good place to leave it there for now, and we'll take a short break. We're back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm with Dr. Nick Colostrum and Dr. Kevin Barrett, and we're now going to talk about the Munich attack at the shopping mall on 23rd of the 7th, 16. So first of all, Nick, what were your first impressions?
Well, first of all, this big heavy numerology is going on. 22/7 that is the 70th anniversary of the King David Hotel being blown up in what was to be Israel in 1946. So that is a very heavy anniversary date. And then 22 also turned up with the Oslo Breivik incident, when you get the main government offices in Oslo being blown up, 22/7. So the numbers 11 and 7 seem to be important in this.
Well, they're actually very important gateway numbers. 11 is the beginning of the action, 22 is the action in progress, and 33 is the completion of the action. That's why they're used quite a lot by Freemasons, I think.
Ah, right. Yes. Okay. So you've got that date, and then we have the image, the photograph video where Gutjahr is presumably Gutjahr. He hasn't confirmed it. We surmised him. He is pre-positioned. You see the terrorist guy coming out of the McDonald's bar, and then on stage left, a bunch of young people come out, move into the centre of the stage, and then bang, 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 and they rush off. And this is all, it's very amateur. Nobody gets hit. No blood spurts out. Nobody falls on the ground. Nobody's apparently dead. And the bits of theatre you see around this event, you don't really see anybody wounded looking. So this is just a bit of, I would say, it's a bit of rather feeble theatre acting, and which is rather unreal. And also Gutjahr's daughter is inside this Olympia shopping mall. She's some sort of wannabe journalist, and she tweets the event. So you got his daughter involved, as well as his wife being a Mossad agent. So
it's a family business.
Family business, yeah. Right.
Okay, Dr. Barrett, what about the perpetrator of this? Can you tell us a bit about him?
I haven't studied this as closely as I have some of the others because I was just finishing up my book, Orlando False Flag, as this happened.
Yes.
I did, of course, catch the amazing Richard Gutjahr on location with his daughter, once again after Nice. So I wrote that up. As far as this perpetrator, though, it seems that he's kind of a perfect bad guy, representing the threat of the evil Muslim barbarian hordes, coming into Europe. I think that we need to emphasize that this kind of divisive wedge issue of immigration in Europe is, I think, being used to stoke up the tension as part of a strategy of tension. Well, it may have backfired with the Brexit referendum, but I don't think it's any accident that we've had so many concocted stories of refugees, Muslims and refugees, doing these horrific things. So they've got this patsy now. It's interesting that he's not. They haven't even really tried to make him out to be a fanatical Muslim, but they don't seem to do that very often. I mean, usually these people, like the guy in Nice, all these patsies, the Charlie Hebdo patsies, the Kouachi brothers who were busted for child pornography, the guy in Orlando, Omar Mateen, who is actually gay himself. He wasn't a fanatical Muslim attacking gays. He was apparently the self-hating gay man or something. In any case, they sell the story as an attack by radical Islam to stoke up the fear of Islam and keep the clash of civilizations and the war on terror going, focusing on radical extremist Islam. And yet they repeatedly keep choosing patsies who have absolutely nothing to do with Islam at all. People who are the most un-Islamic people in terms of their behavior and their lifestyles that they could ever possibly find, like the alleged 9/11 hijackers who were always on gambling junkets on Jack Abramoff's casino boats, who were dating strippers and snorting cocaine and drinking whiskey and leaving an alcohol-soaked Quran on the bar the night before they supposedly went and martyred themselves. This is so ludicrous. It makes you wonder why they are unable to find actual religious, pious, or even extremist Muslims to use as patsies. And I guess they don't need to, because the public is so dumbed down, so stupid, that all it takes is a Muslim name and they'll believe that this is some kind of threat from radical Islam. And so, yeah, once again, we had one of these patsies. It has nothing to do with Islam, and yet all of the media coverage is stoking up fear of radical Islam.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I was just looking up ECE Project Management. This was the owners of the shopping mall where this happened outside, and it's was owned by Werner Otto, who died in 2011, who was an Israeli Argentinian. His son took over, Alexander Otto, from year 2000. I think there may be some interesting connections here with other Zionists owning shopping malls, like maybe Frank Lowy and the Brussels attacks, which we covered at the time. Have you got anything to say on that, Nick?
Well, not the shopping mall, just on the... there's a vague uncertainty in the sense that early reports had 3 different shooters in this event, and that then came down to the one that we're talking about. And the early reports, the number of dead kept varying, which is rather odd. It was 6 to start with, then it went up to 9 or 10, and then it became 9 finally. You'd have thought the number of dead people shot was a fairly definite kind of thing. But so that varied quite a lot in initial versions of this story. Yeah.
All right then. So Kevin, you said you haven't had that much time to research this.
Yeah. So I think the location in yet another Zionist-owned shopping mall is interesting in a number of ways. One, as you mentioned, Frank Lowy, who was one of the big financiers behind 9/11, along with Eisenberg and Larry Silverstein, these Jewish Zionist billionaires. In the case of Silverstein, a close friend of Netanyahu, who arranged for the World Trade Center to be privatized before 9/11, just shortly before 9/11, even though it was condemned for asbestos, and they would have lost their shirts if they had, the Silverstein and his backers would have gone bankrupt almost immediately if it hadn't been blown up. And then they were able to rake in that massive insurance windfall, billions of dollars on a relatively paltry investment. And Lowy is, of course, a shopping mall magnate, so it's not that surprising that they're doing it in another Zionist-owned shopping mall. They seem to like to use terrain that they control. The Trade Center came under their control before 9/11, making it possible to plant the demolition charges and set up that event. Likewise, the Bataclan nightclub, as Nick mentioned, was owned by the Zionists who sold it on September 11th before the event happened. But it was their security team, which is another Zionist Israeli security team, remained in control at the Bataclan. So they had control of that scene as well. And Nice is notoriously under the control of a sort of Zionist, Southern French mafia. I was told by a guy who's a former Algerian intelligence guy who's very well plugged in to the French, Franco, and North African intelligence that they were planning to hit the Eiffel Tower, but weren't able to do it. They didn't have total control of Paris, and so they had to go down to Nice where they run the scene. So they're always doing these things on terrain that they can control. And so that's a possible clue as to why we would once again find a big-time Zionist shopping mall owner controlling the terrain. And then once again, they did this in a shopping mall because everybody goes shopping. It's just the same way they had to send anthrax because everybody has a mailbox. 9/11 hit airplanes. Everybody flies. The towers, though, not everybody works in high rises. So they had to kind of emphasize that everyone is at risk from this evil scourge of radical Islamic terrorism by sending anthrax to people and saying everybody with a mailbox is at risk. Well, now anybody who walks along a boulevard in Nice or anywhere is at risk. Anybody who goes shopping is at risk. And this is ludicrous. Why would angry Muslims target random people like this? I'm an angry Muslim myself, frankly. And if I were stupid enough to actually think that targeting somebody was going to help my cause, the last thing I would do would be to go out and randomly kill innocent people. I'd go after the perpetrators. I'd go after people who are responsible for the deaths of millions of Muslims. And I know where they are, and I know where they live, and I know where I could find them if I wanted to go after them. And so could any other angry Muslim. But that never happens. All we see are these going after the random innocent civilians, like that quote from the perpetrator of Operation Gladio in court. He said you had to go after the innocent civilians, people far removed from any political gain. The purpose is to make people rush to the state to ask for security. So whenever innocent people far from any political gain are killed, it's a false flag. Actual angry political people, such as angry anti-imperialist Muslims, would not do that.
No, that's a really good point. And of course, this waging war by deception, which is the Mossad motto, is actually becoming a bit clearer to people. I think the tactics are exposed. I think there's limited tactics being used. What do you think, Nick?
Well, I agree, and we're at the situation now where there isn't a single politician in the Western world who will speak words of truth about this, and can that really go on for much longer? I feel that this, what happened with Gutjar and his wife just now, has been so manifest and obvious that I think that's got through to a lot of people that hadn't previously been dismissive. Normally, any middle-class employed white guy will just say, "Oh, I'm not into conspiracy theories." You know, you always get the stereotype response. At least, perhaps I should say, in my country, in England, that is the response you always get. And I hope this gets through to more people that this is an intensified war on terror that's going on, but it still isn't Muslims that are doing it. That's the kind of paradox.
Just to finish up, Nick, do you want to give us your 3 points that you've taken to court about this?
What, for the Munich event?
Yes. If you've got them.
Well, I would say, as before, a challenge to provide death certificates. That is a very good start, I would say. If has anybody really died? Otherwise, it's just street theatre. And then I think just the tweets that the tweets and photographs that Gutjar and his daughter put out on this event, I think those are enough to indicate something funny is going on. I think it'd be nice if we could get more details of who they thought the 3 people were initially, how they thought that story developed. But on the whole, I would say this. I'm surprised at German people taking this seriously and believing the story.
Yes. Would you like to finish up then? Say anything, Kevin? I know you've not researched this event as much as many other events which you've written about. Is there anything you'd like to add to what Nick says about this particular event?
Well, sure, I agree. My 3 points to take to court would be the tweets by Gutjar and his daughter, as Nick said, but I would also emphasize that Gutjar's claim that he accidentally deleted these images after he took them and tweeted them from his camera, so he no longer possesses them. He's quoted as saying that in a story by the Jewish Telegraph Agency. That is so ludicrously improbable. It's like even the word improbable doesn't do justice to it. How can one accidentally delete something that you've already tweeted? It's up on Russia Today. It's on your camera. And this is incriminating evidence. And these photos came down from his Twitter account and from RT just minutes after I put out my story exposing him. Well, within an hour of when my story exposing him for being on location, pre-positioned in Nice and in Munich came out, less than 1 hour later, those photos came down. And then he told the Jewish Telegraph Agency that he had accidentally deleted the photos. Haul him into court and cross-examine him, and that will fall apart.
Well, exactly. And the other thing is, if he's going to upload them to a news agency, they'd probably be on the desktop of his computer. That's where you usually upload from, isn't it? So, you know, there's the idea that everything's been lost from his side is
crucially important, valuable photos like that, just accidentally deleting them? Come on, he's a professional photographer. This is ridiculous. Get him in court, put him under oath, and tear him apart.
Exactly. Do you want to say anything to finish up, Nick?
Well, I think that's it, really, Mark. I just hope we've got some way of getting this vocabulary, the language we've been using, into a normal political arena, so that people in political parties and people standing for election can find a way of using this discourse, because otherwise you're just getting the comic book concept of pure evil, which has in a way ruined our whole civilization. The comic book concept that somebody's wicked and evil just because that's the way he is, and he's got to be killed, and therefore, and that can warrant the war, isn't it? Can justify war, and the only way we can overcome this is by getting some sort of truthful discourse out, and we always lose in a sense because politicians and mainstream media won't do this, but I feel we're getting near some sort of turning point here.
Yes, I agree, Nick. it's becoming fast and frequent, and the mask is slipping. So where can we find your work?
Oh, well, I just got blogs on Terror on the Tube. Hopefully I've got a manuscript, Chronicles of Stoke Fabricated Terror of Europe. That might be emerging this year, Mark, with a bit of luck. But there you go.
That's great. And Dr. Barrett, where can we find you?
Well, actually, Nick is in this book, the another French false flag book. We Are Not Charlie Hebdo book. Together, these two cover terrorism in Europe in recent years. And then this brand new book that just became available on Amazon today, which is called Orlando False Flag. That covers Orlando and Nice, with even a little bit about Munich as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Kevin Barrett and Dr. Nick Colostrum, for being on Windows on the World. And I'd like to speak to you again sometime soon in the near future. Thanks a lot.
Okay, cheers.